reference to monads, I would like to invite you to take the entire slew of arguments that we read up about social theory, about caste, and transfer that set of arguments to another phenomenon. And that is the fact that 40% of Indians have a body mass index below 40% of Indians have a body mass index below 18.5. Now, how do we apply this set of arguments about caste if we transfer those arguments to this phenomenon? And not only that they have it today, but they've had it for a long, for as far back as we can think, and as far as indications go, they're going to continue having it for the foreseeable future. In that kind of a situation, how do we transfer these set of arguments?
Yes, Dr. Chaudhary, and then.
Satish, I just wanted to, extend this question of reservation, moving from the welfare theory of reservations to this republican sovereign theory a little further. Which is this, and I think the indication for that is found in Ambedkar. So at one place, Ambedkar says that from the 19th century, the untouchables do have certain civil rights, certain political formal rights. But that doesn't help, because dominant Hindu society blocks the exercise of those rights. So you need some sort of a, like you said, some sort of a further compensatory device to facilitate the exercise of it. So the question is not the form of the right, which partially, not entirely, but partially does exist. But the real question is how to make those rights an exercise of it. And for that you need an extra intensity, a further preaching, which makes it partisan. And that partisan nature of otherwise an equal right is something essential to the situation. In that sense, the Republican equality is already further intensified through a conscious partisan reservation move. That's one. But I think there's a further thing in it. I think the real resistance, the real violent difficulty that the upper caste has to reservation is not just with the form, the republican form, but is with the exercise. Because what happens with the exercise of right through reservation is that political power in its exercise becomes social power again. But now it becomes a social counterpower. So that the lower castes, who in social hierarchy are meant to be subjects to power, become people who can exercise power. And this becomes really vivid in the case of that controversy about whether there should be reservation in promotions. So I was at CSDS at that time, and there was a debate about this. So people who otherwise were absolutely for reservation, nevertheless had a problem with reservations in promotion, because they said, look, you have the job. Now it's an equal playing field, so why should a senior, just because that person is upper caste, be made to undergo the superiority of a reserved candidate when he or she is given promotion? But the whole point was that if it is an exercise of power, that the person in a situation when she does have a job is still under double subjection of power. One is the exercise of power by the official superior, and the second is the upper caste social power. So to that extent, promotion is that much more justified. That is through reservation. Because it must be continuously translated back into the social intensity of power. And to that extent, it's not merely a sovereign argument, it's also an argument of the exercise of power. That was my point.
Question you, how you look at current trends, of caste in an international theoretical perspective, because there is absolute absence caste as a phenomenon in international theory, unlike gender and international relations and race and international relations. Thank you.
Yeah, sir, here. the confusion is that when we say it's an unending process, what about the logical ends of the theory building? Logical ends of any theory building process.
Logical ends or
End.
aids?
End.
Ends.
Yeah, logical ends, number one. Number two is maybe you cited the example of Kancha Iliah as that 3 lines. Maybe if you take the example of the Ashish Nandis, maybe what has created and debated all over the country in the context of reservation and other maybe the corruptions and so on. Ashish Nandi is maybe
You mean Jaipur literary?
Jaipur's. Okay, if you link with the maybe in this context, maybe say replace the Kancha Iliahs to maybe Ashish Nandis. Number 2, and maybe throw some light on those things when we are in a process of theory building. Number 2, and the third is when you say I know problematizing with the foreign and indigenous process in theory building. But how do we apply this, maybe the same in the context of maybe this globalization process, maybe particularly the recent trends, what my friend has said already. How do we maybe have a balanced or maybe a non-balanced? So that is something that confusion is in my mind. So these are the couple of things which I wanted to share with you. Thank you so much.
Let me say what I've understood and then we can start with that. You're suggesting a form of categorization or perhaps even a form of identity that uses criteria or bases other than ascription, other than what we normally associate with identity politics. And whether the kind of logic that I'm talking about would work there or not. I think if I've understood you correctly, I think the problem of politics, understood classically, begins precisely, contemporary politics begins precisely where objective criteria of the sort you're saying, where it would be easy to identify through a particular method the people who belong to certain body mass category, where they have failed to operate or failed to mobilize in a political sense. I'm stating this as a fact, not as a necessary that such criteria can never mobilize and only other kinds of criteria can mobilize. I'm not sure about the answer to that question. But I think identity politics is not necessarily taking away space from another kind of successful politics. Because it is precisely the impasses of that kind of politics that have ceded space to identity politics. And given the salience of identities, it looks to me there is no easy way of bypassing them before reaching towards more universal forms of identification or categorization that we have traditionally in the social sciences been interested in. In other words, what I'm saying is that even if in some abstract sense everyone may agree in an abstract sense that we need to move towards a casteless society, the concrete ways in which we would move would be caste determined in today's world. And this is the contradiction we are living. The contradiction that to move to that future, we must necessarily pass through a present that is full of so many pitfalls associated with these kinds of politics. I'm not sure if this is addressing your question fully, but I'd be very happy to carry on this discussion after that. The exercise of rights, and this is I'm trying to formulate this well enough, but I haven't. I'm still groping. I'm really struck by the Indian investment in relative status. The Hindustani term aukat. You can say it's one of those words that is so loaded with meaning, that the way you say it, the intonation in which you say it can convey a host of things. And what is aukat? Aukat is quintessentially a relational thing. nobody has an awqat in and of themselves. They always have an awqat in relation to something else. And we as a culture seem to be invested so deeply in this relative sense that we are almost uncaring about our absolute position. What really matters to me is how much lower somebody lower than me is, and how much higher, how much closer I'm able to get with whoever I think is higher than me. Any change in that relative distance, that social distance, especially from those below, enrages me. It makes me lose myself. And this is the excess that we see in what is termed atrocity, or in the bizarre and inhuman, whatever words you use are not enough, where 9-year-old girls are raped or 5-year-old girls are raped. How else could one, the language of explanation cannot even begin to understand. But it is triggered by this sense that ये लोग अपनी औकात भूल रहे हैं. In other words, they are forgetting how much below me they are supposed to be. And therefore, my sense of who I am depends on how much lower others are to me. So I'm invested in a positive sense in the relative inferiority of others. If we, there are Anup, and there are other, yes, Anup is there, and you yourself, we need psychoanalytic, whatever resources to try and understand this. This is like the bizarre world of nuclear warfare or something, where logic completely, there's this phrase, making the rubble bounce. After you have about 40 nuclear devices, the rest are all completely unnecessary. And they can only be used to make the rubble bomb. Everything, you've leveled everything. But after that, however many thousand weapons that exist, they don't, and yet systems produce them, go to great trouble to produce them. And you can only think of it in a psychoanalytic sort of.
The creative idea of sovereignty is different from the
yes. Yes. So for a mentality of this kind, modern sovereignty is indigestible. So in a sense, our culture suffers from a permanent kind of irritable bowel syndrome, with regard to this, where we just can't, just can't digest it, and we can't spit it out because we want to be modern. We can't digest it, and we are living in this great discomfort, which erupts in, symptomatically, which erupts in different ways. So once again, I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but this is how I see it. Rohan asked about the absence of caste in international theory. Personal answer, I couldn't care less. If it's not there in international theory, it's not there. Too bad. Too bad for them. We should get on with dealing with the problems we are dealing with. And we should try to do it as best as we can. We should be transparent about it. We should offer our reasoning to anyone who wants to look at it. If they don't want to look at it, too bad. Some first logical ends. When I say that social theory is a never-ending process, I don't mean that it's like one of those films of those Central European directors that, in the 70s and 80s, where you sat for hours and you're not quite sure whether anything had happened. It's not like that. The fact that it doesn't end doesn't mean that nothing happens. Things are happening, you're moving. Yeah, you're making progress, but every piece of progress, and sometimes you lose ground, you retreat. The only thing that is certain about each of these is that it is not permanent. You make progress, again you will run into some block somewhere. So, it may sound as though, we have to stop thinking of a specific destination. That I want exactly 57 rupees worth of theory. That is enough for me. After that, mera kaam hai. I don't need anymore. It's not like that. And in that sense, theory is not a matter of choice. Because there is a problem you cannot avoid and you cannot solve. So you can't avoid it, you can't solve it, you're living with it, and in the process of living with it, those of us who are supposed to be thinking about things, it's our job to think. It's your job, if you are going to be in academics, to think. And it's not necessarily only academics. Anybody who's dealing with problems, you have to think about it. And what will result if the struggle is committed enough and it involves enough people, it will produce something. But it will produce something as a preliminary solution. That solution will change things. It's not that it will be unchanging. You will move forward, but you will not reach a fixed destination. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah, I think
There's a nice hot cup of tea.
not very enjoyable usually. So there's this, usually we have this thing of, like they say, sirf dari wale reh jate hain. The only person who remains is the person to whom the dari belongs, on which everybody is sitting. So it's good to see so many of you coming back. Let's continue with the second theme of modernity. Very, very broad and very hard to pin down an idea, and yet a very important idea. This theory, then you pick it up and apply it. Because theory happens in the doing, where you are struggling with something. But to do theory, you can't just wake up one morning and say, I'm going to do theory and start doing theory. You have to do a lot of boring, painful stuff. You have to learn things. You have to learn. After all, others have tried to do these things before. And as you know, there are very, very few genuinely new questions. In a sense, every dissertation, each one of you who's writing a dissertation or has written a dissertation, in theory it's supposed to be all new, right? But we know that in a fundamental sense, there are very few new things. So however original, new you think your question is, the one thing you can be certain is that someone else has asked that question or something resembling that question before. This doesn't mean that you can go home, there's nothing for you to do. But you have to find out what happened when that question was raised before. And that's what we do in our theory courses. But it doesn't end there, is what I'm trying to say. So many people seem very worried that they had been wasting their time in theory courses and so on. So I want to assure you that that is the boring training that you have to do. You can't just wake up one morning and say that you will become Sachin Tendulkar. Because what you see of a Sachin Tendulkar is after years and 6-10 hours of practice a day. Right? And that kind of riyaz has to be done. And there's no point talking about it. You just have to do it. That's why I'm not talking about that part. I'm taking for granted that part. And our job in this workshop is to talk to you about live theory. And that's what I'm trying to get across to you, what live theory is. But just as you can't just overnight become a test batsman or a bowler, you have to go through all of that training is necessary. And it's your job to extract the most of whatever training you're getting, to put some pressure back on institutions so that training improves in ways that. Okay. So here the pair of articles I had suggested for this theme of modernity. One is by MSS Pandian, a friend of mine who is no more now. It's less than a year since he passed away. And this article is called One Step Outside Modernity. Caste, Identity Politics and Public Sphere. This was published in 2002, and the essence of this article appears in his later book, Brahmin, Non-Brahmin, which some of you may know. And the basic theme that Pandian is taking up here is the two ways in which caste is spoken about after the advent of modernity. I'm deliberately not getting into definitions of modernity or of those issues. We'll set that aside for the moment. Let us simply think of modernity. Well, actually, I can't. Let me very quickly say something. What's the problem with the idea of modernity? The problem with the idea of modernity is that it spreads all over the place. So, to begin with, modernity sometimes looks like it is simply another name for the contemporary, for the present, that which exists today. And it is modern in relation to some past. And in this sense, it is a generic, and in that sense, it's a truism. It's a trivial concept. Because every present will have had a past. And so it's simply a fact of life. It's not really doing any work as a theoretical concept if you think about it in that flat temporal sense, as part of a sequence. But there is another sense of modernity as a normative order, as an order that exerts normative pressure on us. That is to say, after we come into contact with modernity, after the fact, as many theorists have written in different ways, after that fact, we want to be modern. And it is this that we want to take on the values, the prescriptions of modernity. So in other words, this idea of modernity is a normative idea, and it is not a temporal idea. It's not necessarily a period, though it may be associated with a particular period and so on. But it is about the near universal hegemony of an interconnected set of ideas that acts as a normative numeraire or normative standard against which we look at the world. And roughly speaking, think of modernity as this. For the moment, forget about West, non-West, colonialism. All of those are important questions. Anup may raise them, but for the moment we are bracketing them. Bracketing means we know they are there, they are important, we are not running away from them, but you can't deal with everything at the same time. So you are setting aside a set of problems, knowing that they are there. So, as has been said by different theorists in different ways, the problem of modernity outside of the West is that it usually comes with a particular set of power relations. They may be either straight colonialism, or in cases like China or Japan, they may be influence that is not quite direct colonialism, but nevertheless an unequal power relationship anyway. So modernity for the non-West is associated with these unequal relationships. So we in the non-West arrive at modernity through this extra dimension of inequality. So we have a conflicted relation to modernity. We desire it, we want to be modern, because that's what modernity is. In a sense, that tautological definition. Modernity is that which makes you want to be modern. And at the same time, modernity belongs to or is colored by the colonial masters, being the colonial masters' possession, or at least it looks like that initially to us. And this is the standard thing worked out by Bharat Chatterjee, others. So we need to have a distinctive modernity. Because if we don't have a distinctive, separate or distinguishable modernity, then we will simply be imitating the colonial master. And that is unbearable. So you want to be modern, but you don't want to be modern in the way that the colonial master is modern. So you want to be modern in your own way. And this is a necessity. It's not almost not a choice. It's a predicament of non-Western societies. So against this background, Pandian is talking about two ways of talking about caste after the fact of modernity. So on the one hand, because it is so fundamentally hierarchical or unequal, caste is seen as not just unmodern but perhaps anti-modern. So caste as an institution for Indians wanting to be modern cannot be left alone. You have to be seen as doing something about caste. At the same time, caste offers identities of radically different sorts. There are castes that benefit from the system, and there are castes that are the victims of the system or that lose from the system. So, in an era of modernity, where caste itself is, as they say, there is a bad smell about it. You don't want to talk about it. It's embarrassing. But you have a divided set of subjects. Some whose caste identity is such that it was of benefit to them, some whose caste identity is such that they were victims of it. And both are affected by the embarrassment. Modernity makes us embarrassed about caste. Everybody. But this everybody consists of very different kinds of people. So in this context, two ways of talking about caste emerge. And this is related to the hyper-visibility, invisibility point I was making earlier. So Pandian is pointing out, he starts with R.K. Narayan and he looks at some other upper caste writers' autobiographies, where caste is not really explicitly present, and contrasts this with lower caste authors, particularly Dalit authors, whose biographies foreground caste all the time, because that is the condition of their existence. So, in the upper caste biography, it's not as though caste is absent, but it is absent as caste. It is present in some other guise. It is talked about, it is transcoded, as Pandian says. So there is a code language in which the upper caste speak of caste. And this code language allows them to distance themselves from their caste and not have to own up to it in a frontal sense. Because this is under the horizon of embarrassment. The horizon provided by modernity, which we want. We want modernity. And on the other hand, there are the victims of caste who are foregrounding their caste and are talking about it explicitly. In this context, the nationalist movement proposes, as Professor Satish has suggested and others have refined this in different ways, a split between the material and the cultural world, the inner and the outer world. So the acceptance of subordination or defeat in the material world can be effected, and facing up to this defeat is possible because you construct the world of culture or the inner world as a world uncontaminated by the West and as a pure world of your own, which is proof of your distinctiveness and your own greatness. So this is where the formula that is in all our DNAs is there in almost most films, it is there everywhere. So the Indian way of being modern, or rather correction, this is the correction that Pandian is making, the upper caste Indian way of being modern is to say that we combine the best of both worlds. Right? Well, at one time we were producing these beauty queens, frequent intervals, And what did they say? They said that Indian womanhood is the union of best of both worlds. We are both traditional and we are modern. But Pandian's question is, what is the traditional? What is the great and ancient culture that is held up as the enabling contrast to the West? That is held up as that which gives us agency in our fight to catch up with the West in the material sphere, where we have accepted that we are behind, we have lost. Because of the hegemony of the upper caste over the nationalist movement, this tradition that is invoked as a resource or ammunition in the battle, ideological battle against colonialism, is a Brahminical or Vedic civilization is invoked. By invoking such a view of tradition, what is lost sight of by most theorists and by public discourse at the time is that this has the effect of excluding large parts of the population who have not been part or could not be part, once again by law, were not part of this great and ancient culture. So what happens when you start thinking about this confrontation between nationalists and the colonial powers? What happens when you think of their invocation of tradition as multiple traditions, not a single tradition but multiple traditions available for invoking, not all of which get invoked. So this is related to the two ways of talking about caste. So the upper caste way of talking about caste becomes, so to speak, allegorical, becomes indirect. Whereas the mode of the lower caste is direct and the opposite of allegorical, whatever it may be, literal, if you like. What happens after independence? After independence, this syndrome is continued into the hypervisibility, invisibility issue that I have already talked about. There is an attempt to delegitimize caste, even in the pre-independence period. This is what Pandian is arguing. Delegitimize caste as a legitimate or a proper subject to talk about when one is talking about politics. Because caste is seen as the world of culture, it is the inner world, it is not to be part of. This is carried over into the post-colonial period as the Nehruvian inhibition about talking about caste. And this is not just India, there are other places also where this is being tried, the standard thing of a caste-blind state. Whereas our central predicament, once again this is not hardly unknown at that time, but in retrospect, with so many examples of this kind across the world, we know the option of caste blindness or race blindness or any other kind of blindness, in a sense, wishes away the central problem. The central problem before these societies is to acknowledge the undeniably unequal present, how to move from that unequal present to a future that is more equal. Because that is what modernity wants, that we should desire equality, even if it is not present today. And we want to be modern. So always that ideal is present. But the option that is taken of, in a sense, banishing caste from at least the national public sphere has as its counterpart the vociferous language of caste politics. So one side doesn't directly speak about caste, speaks about it allegorically through other means, and the other side is constantly foregrounding caste, which otherwise the upper caste rendering of the public sphere airbrushes out of the debate, except indirectly allegorically. Now the other essay that, and this is Pandian's argument. The other essay is my own essay on castelessness, which was published in 2013, where I'm also talking about these two ways of our post-colonial history has seen two ways of harnessing, encashing, yoking or taking advantage of caste. We talk about one way of taking advantage of caste all the time, and the other way of taking advantage of caste we never talk about, or we don't normally talk about. Which is the way we talk about? The way we talk about is caste politics, the entry of caste into politics. And we say this is usually in a tone of regret. Rajni Kothari has written about this very well, where he said that the embarrassment or the moral censure of caste entering politics emanates from a section which seems to want a politics that has no basis in society. A kind of liberal, Western style, abstract, unmarked liberal politics in a society that is completely caste saturated, caste drenched. So it's an unreasonable expectation. Whatever else, whatever the rights and wrongs, it's an unreasonable expectation. So the other way that caste gets utilized by the upper castes is outside the electoral system through larger social processes of the conversion of caste capital into merit capital. So we are all, in a sense, my generation certainly is part of this. My grandfather was a petty landlord. They sold some land. And they were landlords because of, we were the leftovers of Maratha imperialism, its expansion across the country. So Deshpandes, Kulkarnis, Desais, these are all part of the revenue system of the Marathas. And from that gets translated through a long, complicated historical process, suddenly into private property. We have had, as you know, all parts of our country have had multiple layers of different kinds of rights over land. And the arrival of the Western or modern concept of private property is overlaid on this in a very uneven, messy process. But at some point, some ownership rights so that you could actually sell land. So my grandfather sells land to send my father and one of his brothers. One becomes an engineer, one becomes a doctor. And our generation is, how is this possible? It's possible because they had land to sell. Why did they have land to sell? Because of their caste. But when it comes to my generation, my father was an engineer. He worked in Nehru steel plants. I grew up in a context which was suffused with Nehruvian ideas of the secular and so on. I didn't know what my caste was until I was in the 9th standard, because I lived in a completely artificial township that was constructed out of nothing. And for my generation, we say, what has caste got to do with anything? I am where I am because I worked hard. I have merit. Why do I have merit? Because my father could become an engineer, and which is a good job, good government job. So he could send me to good schools, which already by my generation meant private schools. He went to a government school, and government schools at that time were very good schools. From my generation onwards, our class started going to private schools. So this class, in a sense, succeeded from the government educational system. We, in a sense, it converted over 2 generations, or 3 if you want to count it, our caste capital into merit capital. For my grandfather, every single way in which he was addressed foregrounded his caste. So Deshpande wasn't just a name, it was a status, it was a larger category, and there were many other equivalent terms. Shanbhog is another term, all these revenue collection terms. So in other words, my grandfather's identity was self-confessedly inseparable from his caste. He would have been very puzzled if we had said, if this kind of talk, of course he was wrong. There was no question about it. But by the time my generation comes along, we think we have no caste. And even though we are very intelligent, we think that it is mere coincidence that everyone who thinks they have no caste just happens to be from an upper caste background. It's an accident. We are 1.2 billion people, so work out the randomness. And yet, there is nothing random about the distribution of positions of privilege in our society. Once again, statistically, if you think, the odds of less than 20% of the population occupying 90% or more of every kind of position of privilege says that it is a caste society. And that we can't, one of the attributes of the post-colonial era does to caste experience on the part of the upper caste is that it allows them, like Pandian is saying, it allows them a transcoding. My father was literally a part of the great task of nation building. It just so happened that all the engineers around us were upper castes from all parts of the country, but upper castes. Clerical staff was from middle castes, and the workers were all Adivasis there. But we didn't think that development was furthering the caste interests of the upper castes. We thought development was building the nation. It was a sacred duty. So, being able to, the congruency, the produced congruency of the caste interests of the upper castes and the national interest, this became invisible. This became transparent. And we created, from my generation onwards, a set of people who could objectively say that caste had nothing to do with their lives. They just happened to be part of the elite. And people around them who also believed they had no caste also happened to be from the same caste backgrounds. Okay? So it allowed, in my article it's there in more detail, the irony of our new constitution, or new republic, and its progressive, one of the most progressive constitutions in the world. If good intentions were to be a criterion, our constitution would win the World Cup every time in terms of good intentions. But this idea of an abstract citizen is a blessing for the upper caste. Because if you really think about it, what does the new constitution do about caste? Think about this. The new constitution makes it illegal to talk about caste as a source of privilege and advantage. It allows talking about caste only as the source of disadvantage or disprivilege. And those who wish to claim justice for the wrongs that caste has done to them, the constitution forces them to wear their caste on their sleeve. Unless they wave around a placard saying, I'm such and such caste, no benefits. Even if you think in terms of benefits. And what does it allow the upper castes? It gives the blessing of anonymity to the upper castes. Nobody can ask me my caste. I am where I am because of my merit. Don't ask me my caste. I am not demanding any handouts. I don't want reservation. But my reservation has worked already through 2 generations. And it was not visible as reservation. So imposing a system of formal equality on a reality that is deeply unequal is one of the most unjust things you can do. As Ambedkar, various people have said. And so we have a group that is so confident of its built-up lead, its built-up advantages, that it is all the time saying, let us have free competition. And there is another side which is so aware of its accumulated disadvantages that it feels it has no option other than to shout out its caste again and again, to try and get something, to make the race a little more equal. The playing field is completely tilted, but to make it level, what does the new constitution do? It forces the lower caste to speak in the name of their caste. It allows the upper caste to speak in the name of the unmarked universal, to speak in the name of competence, to be simply astronauts. So this ironic inheritance that the constitution, the same constitution, gives these two radically different legacies to the upper castes and the lower castes. And each tries to use that to their advantage. One way of using that to their advantage has to be public, has to pass through the relay of politics. The other can keep out of politics and make politics into a word where the dirty part is silent. And for the other side, politics is your only resource. It's the only way you can get anything. Remember, this is not about nice people, good people, bad people. There are scoundrels on every side. There are saints on every side. It's not about individual, qualities. People, upper caste people, have worked very hard, many of them. That's not the point. The point is the structural advantage, the structural context you have, where your hard work produces results of a particular kind, and someone else's hard work, their structural context is such that it cannot produce those results. So it's not that merit is fraud, as some people argue by short-circuiting it. The point is that the resources to acquire merit are unequally distributed. So as long as we cannot equalize the resources and the routes, as long as the routes to acquire merit do not become equally open to all, simply invoking merit is to endorse an argument that is fundamentally unjust. Now, to say this is easy. To work this out in the context of living institutions that can get damaged, that can crumble under the pressure of so much change in Indian higher education, this is what you're seeing. In the civil services, this is what you're seeing. As they say, all kinds of people now are getting into civil services. All kinds of people are getting into higher education. What this points out is that the past higher education was a very socially homogeneous, very cozy area. And we could have the idea of a dedicated teacher fundamentally underwritten by community or class or category reproduction. What is your standard dedicated teacher? What is the ideal student? The ideal student who will one day become a teacher. Why was this possible? This was possible because everyone in higher education was people like us. Now, all sorts of people are getting in. So it's very hard for teachers to imagine reproducing themselves through these people. So there is a lot of friction. It's not easy. It's not easy at all. It's not that large numbers of people are entering with substandard school education. It's a fact. And substandard school education affects all categories. So we are seeing stress in our institutions. It's a reality. Your generation will really have to, my generation is already edging towards the nepatya, as they say, towards the background. So the point here is that the ironic consequences of modernity and a modern republican constitution is that the same constitution gives two radically different inheritances or legacies to two different groups. And while we are able to be conscious about and analyze and criticize one mode of encashing caste, as we should be critical of it. Caste politics is not a lovely thing in itself. There's nothing, it's not nothing to be proud of. Just as reservation is nothing to be proud of. It's something we require because of the preconditions. Caste politics becomes a necessity because of the preconditions. But the other kind of encashment of caste is development, is nation building. This is wrong. We had to be as critical, name this other kind of caste inheritance as we should be critical of the others. But one side gets constructed as the honhar balak kind, who has actually gone beyond caste. And the other side is the naughty child who is constantly doing shaitan by indulging in caste politics. It is this is a too naive approach, and we cannot afford to work with a picture such as this. But let me underline once again, bringing about even a semblance of a little bit more equality in a country and society like ours is a very messy, completely strife-laden task. And it should be the job of social theory to help us think beyond individual anecdotes, beyond good and bad people, to structural realities that face us, particularly the structural realities that society trains us not to see. So there is nothing inherently good about caste, whether of this side, that side, whatever. But our discourse on caste is very biased. It's not, because one side is not even recognized as a caste discourse. And that is the reason why we are not making progress. So in short, perspectives of this kind, which started the 1990s, were a major watershed for social theory as well. And you can see it in various collections, various places. It's visible. Because the 1990s made it clear that everybody has caste. Whether you talk about it, whether you know it or not, everybody has caste. And the sooner we start to recognize this and work with it, the sooner we will be in a position to actually deal with the problems that we have. So far we are doing shadow boxing. Not really, because we are not identified the questions properly. This part I want to stop here because we need to be time and we should try and be on time, finish by 12:30. So I invite your questions.
My name is Kamlesh Kumar, and I am here as a research associate working in Tata Institute, Center for Human Rights Education, School of Law, Rights and Constitutional Governance. Sir, you talk about these equalized resources
For producing merit.
and
So rather than saying that merit doesn't exist or it's a fraud, we have to look at the distribution of the resources with which merit can be produced or is produced.
so looking the contemporary scenario, like this land resource bill was presented in Parliament, debated.
Yes.
So, what is your solution in the future? How it can be resources equalized in terms of the contemporary scenario?
Yes, I'm glad you asked that question.
Please mention your name.
My name is Siman and we remain
Simant. Simant.
Sir, rather you talk about dealing with the caste, rather shadow boxing. So how do we do it? By shouting that we are not this caste and this justice or some other way?
Yes, there was a question here. Yes.
Yes. My name is Vishnu. I'm from Hyderabad campus. Sir,
Sorry, tell me your name again.
Vishnu.
Vishnu.
Sir, I don't know whether I am articulating it the right way. If I understood rightly, the thing is, I'm excited to understand the dimension which you are bringing in social theory, especially the process part, and the themes which you actually bringing in, that is the experience and politics, experience and politicization of experience. But on the one side, you mentioned about the experience, politicization of the experience, but at the same time you are talking about the anecdote.
Yes.
So my question is like, how can we understood, or you are saying like, we need to add another dimension to three of these, like a historic dimension. Otherwise it becomes problematic in the theorizing process. So if we add that dimension, I just want to know like what are the principles which actually we have to keep in mind to make the process.
My name is Lalita. I just had a question about, when talking about caste discourse, and particularly talk about it's very problematic and extremely unequal, silencing of one. So from that, I'm just wondering, do we see a difference here in the location of where this discourse is also coming from? I'm assuming that the upper caste discourse is also coming, or is maybe more biased, because you have people located in larger cities, perhaps especially in metropolitan areas. We know that a lot of policy also comes from their society. So I'm just wondering, how can you maybe break this down a little bit? This caste discourse, does it vary in the way the discourse takes place and the way it manifests? If we look across the scale of not only urban areas but also, say, villages, for instance, do you see any differences here in the way in which the discourse is used, it manifests?
I have, you have mentioned just now in your presentation that there is nothing inherently good about caste. But if you look at these kind of debates or theorization which we see especially from someone like Bhalchandra Nemade, who talks about his recent novel called Hindu, somewhere it appears that he's kind of celebrating caste in itself. And what would your response be to that kind of implication? Thank you.
Just maybe I would like to make one point and then maybe one question. When I sent my students for their field work to Gujarat, and they realized that there is no caste but there is a casteism. Maybe how do we problematize this? There is no caste exists, but when there is an incidence, maybe the equalization of the resources, casteism comes in. One point. Talked about this modernity particularly, not modernity, modernity, modernization. It has roots right from maybe the process of Sanskritization, and now maybe we are dealing with the different phenomena. Can we say modernity can become a strategy or maybe a counter-hegemonic strategy to annihilate the caste in contemporary India? Whereas Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar also has suggested in his paper, that long paper, that annihilation of the caste, and he has suggested certain counter-hegemonic strategies for the annihilation of the caste. And second point is that my friend has already raised that question, but how do we equalize the resources or maybe the equitable distribution of the existing resources? And already Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar suggested there is nationalization of the resources and particularly the land. How do we take it maybe as a strategy also when we are formulating policies for the poor and landless peoples in the context of particularly India?
Okay. Can we take
Hello.
these six?
My name is Shilpshika from Giri Institute, Lucknow. My question is related to the question of merit. It's well taken, your argument that we need to look at the resources that go in making the merit, the distribution of resources that go into the making of merit. But do we also need to rethink merit or knowledge in terms of what is it? Because with a new group entering into the system in a large way, they also carry with them a new set of knowledge. So, what merit? Because that can also counter in many ways, this inequality and merit questions.
Okay.
And also, as I mentioned in the lunch session, this whole thing of generalization theory, that how do we look at generalization question of theory?